Ja, goedenavond. Goedenavond, dames en heren. Goedenavond. Welkom terug misschien in The Raven. Ik zal het kort houden. Het is een eer om hier te staan om de volgende gasten aan te kondigen. Wij gaan hier luisteren naar een gesprek tussen de wereldberoemde kunstenaar William Kentridge. Beroemd natuurlijk van zijn tekeningen, zijn animatiefilms, zijn prenten. En hij zal straks nog veel uitgebreider worden voorgesteld door Sacha Bronwasser. En Bronwasser is ook degene die hem zal interviewen. Zij is natuurlijk in Nederland ook wereldberoemd. Onder andere van de roman Luister, maar ook als journalist en kunsthistoricus. Geef ze alsjeblieft allebei een zeer warm applaus. William Kentridge en Sacha Bronwasser. Succes.
So you know when you were someone famous in the house, because we were in the bar, but every 5 minutes, the conversation, every 10 minutes, yeah, there was a picture that had to be taken, or an autograph, or just someone saying, I've met you 30 years ago and I've been a fan ever since. So some of them are among you, or all fans, I think. First, let me do a quick survey. Who is familiar with the work of William Kentridge? That's like everybody. Okay, that's good. First, I would like to quote a proverb from Ghana. Of course, I got it from William Kentridge's work. One who has seen 1,000 will never be satisfied with 100. When speaking of artist William Kentridge, one can only speak in multitudes. He's a South African artist, yes, working since the mid-80s from Johannesburg. He's also a from Jewish Lithuanian descent and had a very British upbringing. He has participated, as you know, in hundreds of exhibitions over the globe, including multiple times in the Venice Biennale and the Documenta in Kassel. And here in the Netherlands, his work was presented several times at the Holland Festival, where he was an associated artist last year, and at the Eye Film Museum, and I hope you've seen that installation there and his films. I've never seen so many people cry, actually, in an exhibition as we did in that first exhibition with a long frieze of moving people. But do we know who he is? No. So let me try again. William Kentridge's work contains drawings, paintings, animation films, operas, installations, processions, music, dance, language, and lectures. It was crossing borders before crossing border was invented. It ranges from miniature, automaton, puppet theater to a frieze of works along the Tiber River in Rome, 10 meters high and 500 meters long. That's half a kilometer of drawings. William Kentridge runs 2 studios and sometimes appears in his own work in double, triple, or even quadruple form, talking to and contradicting himself. And I suspect there are multiple William Kentridges, actually, always cleverly dressed in the same outfit to fool us. Well, at least one of them is here tonight, and I'll have the pleasure of interviewing him. He will give... Yeah. Only, yeah. He will give you insight into 6 lectures he delivered last year at Oxford University that are now put into this beautiful book, Anatomy of the Studio, Anatomie van het Atelier, nog mooier allitererend in het Nederlands. And I urge you all to buy this book. And then put the lectures on the monitor at the same time, because you'll have much more moving images. They're still available online on your website and at the website of Oxford University, but do take that book home. And he'll be happy to sign it, I heard. When talking about William Kentridge, it is if the essence of his work constantly multiplies and then starts to whirl around you. It's like confetti, and you know how it goes with confetti. Once you've used it, it will always be there, reoccurring and changing places. And all this started with the discovery of charcoal. Ladies and gentlemen, William Kentridge.
Thank you.
First some water.
Good idea.
Yeah.
Good.
Good. So, where should I put this beautiful book?
Yeah, I can put it. I'll put it on the.
It's not. This is in Dutch. Is
Yeah.
there an English version as well here?
There will be an English version.
So we
it's-
have a premiere here.
This is the premiere,
Yeah.
and in fact, I believe it came back from the publishers yesterday or this morning. So I'm just sort of seeing it now. Yes, it will be. It's not translated. It's in the original English. Next year, it will come out.
Okay. These lectures and this book is called The Anatomy of the Studio. In fact, I already said you have 2 studios. As these studios are so important that you give 6 lectures about them, can you describe them to us? Where are they and what do you do in them?
Well, there are, as you say, there are 2 studios. There's a garden studio, a studio in the garden that is, it's maybe a bit bigger than the stage. It's a fair-sized, domestic-sized studio. And in there is, I do the animation, I do the drawing. There are most of the people in the office around in that studio. And that's kind of the heart. That's the heart of the making. But there's also a larger, more industrial studio in a rough part of the center of Johannesburg, where sculpture is made, where we do rehearsals for performances. The studio sometimes becomes a theater for public performances. It's right next door to the art center we have in Johannesburg called the Center for the Less Good Idea, which is another African proverb that you quoted at the beginning, which we may get back to later to talk about.
I thought that was your invention, the less a good idea. But
No,
it's
the phrase comes from an African proverb which says, from Botswana, it says that, translated, if the good doctor can't cure you, find the less good doctor. And it's the same thing as saying, if the grand ideas of the world no longer hold, look for more local, peripheral ideas that come out of it, both as a strategy for making artworks, as a way of having confidence in what arrives from the edges of what you're making, and having skepticism about the first great, clear idea. But it's also about larger things, what it is to be in Johannesburg and not in the center in Europe or in North America, and taking solace for what things come from the edges as a way of shifting and changing. And also the idea that the great certainties of the 20th century haven't held, and one needs to find a different way of understanding the world.
So a less good idea. And that is above the studio, or?
It's kind of above, it's not literally above the studio, but it's very present in our head, both in my studio, but also in the center itself, in the work that is done.
Is it
at the center.
difficult to convince people to work with you on a less good idea?
Well, you always have to start with what you hope will be the good idea, but you have to be able to relinquish it. You know, all statements made can then be made. There can be performances of certainty, and we know all the ideas that people feel very certain about. You can hold on to the certainty by shouting louder, by being more and more strident. If it's a line that you've drawn, you can go over the line again and again, making it blacker and blacker. And there's always a kind of inherent authoritarianism in holding on to certainty, in holding on to the first idea. And so it's also a relief when you understand you don't have to do that. You can actually accept that something that seemed so clear as you start working with it. It seems such a good idea, but as you start working with it, there are parts that don't quite make sense. There are things that don't add up. A performance you thought was going to be so great, in fact, is not quite. But there's a moment you saw in an improvisation or an edge of a performance or something a musician is doing after the rehearsal that you suddenly recognize. And you recognize it as a kind of a heat in the body. It's a physical thing, like in your armpits or in your saliva glands. That's something there. You recognize something. And you can then start to follow that.
Is it like a bit like falling in love?
I, I've never quite felt falling in love in the back of my tongue in quite the same way that you do with this. And this is also often something that infects a whole group of people watching you're watching an improvisation or a rehearsal on the stage, and suddenly everybody is held by it, and you understand. So that's less private than falling in love, more communal. But it's not entirely dissimilar. It means that you're privileging the category of recognition over knowing, that you're there to be open to recognize something that's inside you or that you've thought about but haven't consciously placed down, that appears as you're watching it. And I think that's the heart of what the less good idea is about.
And what's so wondrous about this, that it's not only you who recognizes this, but it's this group of people. Can you, because you work there in the studio, in the center, or in the rough part of Johannesburg, you work with a lot of people, musicians, dancers, people,
Yes.
technicians. When did that start? When did you move from being someone who draws and then invents charcoal animation to someone doing suddenly
I
operas?
suppose just in terms of biographical route, when I was a student at university, I was working with a student theatre group, and I was also going to drawing lessons in the evening at a private art school. I was studying other subjects at university, neither theatre nor fine arts. But in the theatre group, and this, remember, is South Africa in the 1970s, when there's very strict apartheid. And so this theatre group, which was a mixture of white students, the university was an all-white university, and black actors, some of whom were employed at the university as librarians, as bookshelvers. The heart of that theatre making was about a kind of, in the sphere of apartheid, a kind of a momentary utopian space where people could meet and work together and hear each other's views. And so there was an enormous amount that white students had to learn from black people who had such different lives, and to some extent vice versa. And so from that, there was an understanding of the value of improvisation, of openness to what emerges, to not writing the essay in advance of doing the work, of not having to have a theoretical certainty about what it was that you were doing. And so when I came back to working in theatre, having worked as an artist, I gave up. I tried to become an actor, failed at being an actor, tried to become a filmmaker, failed at being a filmmaker, gave up being an artist, and eventually came back to being an artist. And when the theatre came back into it, it was with a very strong basis of how that could work.
So you knew that, and you, in between, did you try to walk that road alone, like the classical notion of an artist?
There was very clear advice given to me by very good friends who said you must either do a drawing. If you want to do drawing, focus on drawing and become good at drawing. If you want to do acting, go and do acting. If you want to do film, just go and do films. But for God's sake, stop thinking you can do all of these things. You'll fall between them all, which was very good advice, which I followed. And it took me many years to unlearn that, to understand the only hope for the drawing were impulses that came from the theatre. The only way to think about the theatre were images that had come from the drawing and that text that had come. So that wasn't obvious. And then it really made sense finally. I kept on thinking, well, I'm making these drawings while I decide what I'm going to be when I'm an adult. I'll finally get a job. I'll get a real job. Until finally, when I think I was about 30, a friend of mine said, just stop moaning. You've never had a job. You're 30 years old. You're unemployable. No one will ever give you a job. Make your peace with what you're doing and either sink or swim with the drawings. And then I thought, oh, all right. I am an artist. It was like, it took an enormous, it sort of stuck in my throat. It still does a little bit.
Seems like you still remember that moment.
I do very clearly, to suddenly say, okay, I think, if you think of all the thousands of pieces of advice we get during our lifetime, there are only 3 or 4 pieces of advice one ever actually follows. And it's always things that you already know yourself, or that you feel inside, or that it confirms something you have thought. So yes, it confirmed a feeling that I had.
But then there was this other step to being like an artist, to being an artist that is surrounded by many people, artists, non-artists, and giving everybody a piece of that responsibility in the work. And
I mean, I think it does, but there's a natural way in which that expands. So, for example, if you're working with etching, for the first while I did all my own etching and all my own printing and editioning. But then I started being invited to work in a different print studio. So already you're working with master printers and editioning printers, and there's a team, not in my studio, but that you're working with, or working with tapestries. There's a whole existing infrastructure of that tapestry studio you work with. When I started working with films, I would always need an editor to work with. And for many years that was outside the studio. Now the editors are generally inside the studio. So it grows. I mean, the one thing it doesn't help to have anybody in the studio drawing. That doesn't work, to try to get someone else drawing.
yeah.
It
Maybe
doesn't
we
really
can
help to have anyone else in the studio if I'm doing animation, operating the camera. That also I found didn't work in the end. But there are a lot of other spheres. If it's sculpture, I need people in the foundry to work with me. Working with music, I'm not a musician. I'd be working with composers or with singers. So it's a kind of a natural expansion.
Yeah. Going back to drawing, maybe we can show a clip of the drawing. Not what? Well, maybe we can have clip number 2. What I've drawn.
That's a list, yes.
And horizon line.
Okay, the horizon line.
Horizon
I think
line.
let's do number 4. These what we took here were a few clips from a video of the lectures in Oxford, which is the basis for the book, just so you get a sense of how they existed in the lecture form. But maybe we can start with 4.
Yeah.
Number 4, makes a swipe across a sheet of paper. So we don't have the video
it's
yet.
both an impulse, a movement of the arm,
No, there's nothing on the
and
screen.
the thought that suddenly
There's no
divides
image.
Sorry.
the paper.
Okay, let's go back to the beginning of that. So while they're getting that ready, you'll tell us when they're...
Kunnen wij hem opnieuw krijgen?
Are we good?
Well,
Maybe just to talk then a bit about
Yeah.
the lectures.
yes, because in these 6 lectures, which are called The Anatomy of the Studio, the basic question is what we are talking already about, but what is creativity? Which is such a mythical, what is it? I mean, it comes to you, it grows, you can work on it, but you really try to dissect it.
Yes, I think
following certain works in your career,
I mean,
say, how does it work?
Sacha, it's interesting that you describe it as creativity. That's a word that never ever enters into the studio, or that's never there. I mean, what the lectures were, maybe, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm saying that maybe that's what the series becomes about in the end. But the premise of them is describing the activity of the studio as a kind of metaphor, different ways of understanding the world outside the studio. There are things which are very common in the studio, very obvious practices in the studio, which show practices outside the world, but which are invisible outside.
Like what, for example?
Well, to give a very easy example, one's used to the idea of collage, from Picasso onwards, the idea of a bit of rush, a bit of wood, a bit of wallpaper, a bit of newspaper, stuck together to make an image, of different fragments put together to make a coherent image. And one understands this is an easy to follow art practice. What's less common is understanding it's a historical practice also, that Caspar David Friedrich, that John Constable, all of them were making collages of fragments of landscapes.
Well,
So
we see paintings, you see the way they were made, in fact.
Yes, that what appears to be a coherent single image of a landscape in fact, is made up of many sketches made of a tree in this town, a ship seen over here, a rock from there, as you see in their sketchbooks, which are then arranged into the coherent, apparently coherent landscape. But if you say, okay, the world is made up out of these fragments, and one can think of the studio as a place in which the world is invited in and it comes in as drawings, as things pinned to the wall of the studio, as memories, as newspapers, whatever's in the studio. And there, these are fragmented, they're taken apart, and then they're rearranged, and then you send them back out into the world as a drawing or as a performance. So that's a very natural activity in the studio. What's less obvious is the way that of necessity we construct ourselves in the same way. That there's certain things we say, there are certain memories we hang on to from which we construct ourselves, certain books we've read which are deep inside us. And so we're always a collage in our subjectivity, which we make again every day. Let me not say that word, it's just going to give offense. Let me rather focus on this. Let me try to forget this. We're putting together fragments. And also when we read a history, we understand it looks like, okay, we're receiving information which is a coherent history. But what the idea of collage shows that even history is always a construction of fragments, which is why different historians have different histories. And each of these things that appears to be so coherent and perfect is in fact a provisional coherence of a particular arrangement and importance to different fragments. So that's what I mean about this things in the studio being able to illuminate things that are normally invisible outside the studio.
And these things even contain the things that you don't know, that you did not draw, maybe we can...
We can look at either, maybe we can look at the collage at number 1.
Ja. Mogen we een clip? Nummer 1.
The paintings are constructed, they are not found. A collage, a tree is moved across. The waterhouse, the boathouse is shifted from one part of the painting to another. A horse which was drawn in March is put into the painting in August. Sunlight on a tree in one place is placed against the dark shadows of a tree drawn in a different moment by the artist. Now, this practice of collage, of taking fragments from different sources and constructing a new image is not new, though only in the 20th century has collage itself become the subject of many paintings. But Caspar David Friedrich, in his sketchbooks, had many drawings of particular branches of trees, of rocks, and all his paintings are constructions of moving these fragments around to arrive at a finished composition. This is both a natural history of painting, but it is also a natural history of the self.
So the natural history of the self, maybe you can, because from the painting we understand it, but from the self, maybe we can now show the clip with the things that you have not drawn.
Okay.
Yeah? Can I have that? It would be number 2, please.
But if one can make a biography out of what one has drawn, one can also make a negative biography of everything around one, of the space around, defining oneself by that which is not drawn. So, that which I have drawn: an angel writing, a crowd in a landscape, a cow in the waves, a tape recorder, the Union buildings in Pretoria, another rhinoceros, a chaise longue, a side of beef, Marcus Aurelius and Garibaldi, the falls of an African river. But I have not drawn the Queen of England. I've not drawn a photostat machine. I've not drawn a beef Wellington. I've never drawn Don Bradman. I've never drawn a full English breakfast, or a Spanish galleon, or a Weimaraner, or an electric toaster, or the moons of Saturn. I've never drawn a hippopotamus. I've never drawn sunrise over Cairo. But I have drawn an iris, a man on a bicycle, a telephone exchange, a bowl of peonies, a mine headgear, a Roman quinquerine, a toast rack, a wildebeest, an ampersand, the world on its hind legs, my wife in the bath, Goethe in Italy. But I have not drawn Wagner. In fact, I have drawn Wagner. A Coach and Four, the Yorkshire Moors, Emma Lady Hamilton. I've never drawn Yorkshire pudding and roast beef. I've never drawn the Johannesburg City Call, Kenneth Kaunda. I've never drawn a rhododendron, a mass spectrometer, and I've never actually drawn a grapefruit.
So that is like the history of everything.
Well, I think what I was trying to say in that clip in the preamble in the lecture was that there are different ways of arriving at a self-portrait. I mean, the traditional drawing of a face, are the eyes in the right proportion, is the mouth and the chin in the right way. That kind of self-portraiture or portraiture is one way of understanding someone. But there are so many others. I mean, one can think of one's biography being written by all the books you have read, all the books that are on the bookshelf behind you, as one kind of description of yourself or someone. And there's also the negative space around all the books that have not been read, which could have been read, which are not read, all the things you've drawn which become a self-portrait of the longue durée, a long-term self-portrait, all the different images which you've become obsessed by, and the space around everything that was not drawn.
You said that the drawing is, that's the thing that you do on your own. Yeah. And do you always have like this camera hanging above you? Making it possible to make it
No, there's a camera.
moving image, or?
No, there's a camera that is above the main. Well, the larger drawings happen flat on the wall. The smaller drawings happen on a table. And there is a camera above that for the animation. So if you're working either with ink or on a smaller scale, the camera films directly onto the table, the different frames. But it's not as if it's filming the whole time. It's just when there's animation or filming or done specifically for the lectures that it would be filmed.
In one of the lectures, you say that this drawing it's thinking in charcoal. That's a phrase you often use. You're thinking in charcoal, thinking in movement, thinking in breath, thinking in whatever material, but not in words. Can you describe what happens when you start drawing? First there's nothing, and then what? If you still can, after all these decades of constant drawing.
Yes, it's not to say it's random. It's not as if there's nothing there at all. Mm-hmm. There's usually some impulse. I know some idea of what might be there. But it can start very randomly, just with a kind of a horizon. And there's a little clip that shows that. Maybe we show that first, and then I'll talk more about that. And this is number 4. Number 4.
Yeah, 4. Mogen we 4?
One makes a swipe across a sheet of paper, a horizon line. It's both an impulse, a movement of the arm, and a thought that suddenly divides the paper, the sky and earth, the start of a map. Here is the world, here is a continent, the field on which I place myself, understanding, of course, that in the end the drawing is something, a fragment of a self-portrait. So the translation from impulse to image. And this is then what one associates with the image. The vertical charcoal marks are like the winter stubble of grass to the south of Johannesburg after a veld fire. So the drawing touches the original, the veld outside Johannesburg, but only tangentially. This translation touches its origin, but like a tangent to a circle. And even when the translation seems more direct, there's a transformation. One thinks of a mimesis, the most accurate copying of the real world into an artificial form. Now, this has enormous pleasures to make. The trompe-l'œil of a drawing of an object done with such fidelity that your hand reaches out to touch the object. So a pencil crayon traced onto a drawing so that from a distance you can't tell which is the pencil and which is the copy. And all of these have their pleasure. A pleasure of knowing yet still believing. The transformation is at the heart of it. You know the falseness of what it is you are looking at, but you can't resist the tug of its physicalness, and then finding the pleasure in the self-deception. Okay, so to talk about drawing, the thing about a drawing is that
The activity of making the drawing is usually the discovery of what the drawing is. So it's not a preparatory drawing or otherwise. That making of the preparatory drawing is the moment of discovering what it is. And so it's always premised on the hope that the drawing knows more than the artist, that the drawing is more intelligent than the artist. And that if you know everything the drawing is going to do, there's very little point in making it. The hope there will be surprises, an open conversation as the drawing is being made. And that's, I suppose, why I think of drawing as the start and the heart, whether it ends up as a performance or as a film, or even as a lecture. The strategy of drawing is the heart of the way of working.
In one of the lectures, the last one, you said drawing is optimism. And
well, I think there's an optimism in what it is to make the mark on the sheet of paper and not just walk away from the empty sheet. I mean, it's both an optimism, but it's also, of course, a kind of neurosis. I mean, one has to understand that there is something wrong with all artists. There are many people who go through the world completely happy without having to leave some snail's trail of the presence of themselves outside in the world. Whereas, so you think, what is this obsession that all these sheets of paper which are from you but are more than you or separate from you that you can leave behind? There's a kind of a fundamental gap in artists, I think, when people who feel they have to write or make things to keep going on doing that. So yes, there is an optimism in the fact of the making. There's an optimism that someone will look at it, even if the person who's looking at it is going to be the artist or the writer themselves, of the possibility of an agency of making, of not being completely determined by one's circumstances.
When you also talk about this act of working, you yourself, but also the people around you, and you say it's while working we are aware of being outside ourselves and watching our pleasure of self-deception. We are at the edge of meaning. Yeah, it is. Yeah, you said it.
That. I know, but I think what I was saying, I was at the edge of meaning. I wasn't sure what it meant. No, there are. I mean,
Oh, you were quite confident in these pages. You're quite about
know,
the importance of
I would describe
not understanding.
I would describe that as a performance of confidence, in the hope of convincing other people. I mean, it's very often when I'm working in the theatre group, and I have to say, they say, well, what is the project? What are we doing? The activity of describing it to them as if I knew what I was doing is part of the activity of discovering what it is that we're going to be doing and what I am. So that moment of talking it into existence is an important one. But what I was referring to there, I think, the pleasures of self-deception. I think you can. It's when one is aware. So today in the Moritz house, and I was looking at the late Rembrandt self-portraits and the fantastic paintings there. And you see there are really three elements to the seeing, I think. The one is up close. You see the extraordinary paint. You can feel the brush mark as it was put on the impasto. You feel the complete confidence of, Rembrandt towards the end of his life, the way every mark is somehow, the brush knows where it has to go. Even, it's not himself even consciously thinking, make it a little fatter and a little thinner here. It's the hand knowing, and it's exactly. So there's that paint. And as you take a step back, suddenly it's not paint, it's the shine on his nose, or it's the tuft of hair as it goes under his cap. So there's this transformation of paint into flesh. And the third thing is your pleasure at feeling, I'm seeing two things. I'm seeing both these things. I'm seeing both paint and I'm seeing flesh. And I can shift between the two of them. And how can I let myself, I can see it's only paint, but I can't resist the impulse of understanding it also as the flesh and the person there. And what is the pleasure I get from the self-deception? You can't resist. It's not like a willing suspension of disbelief. I'm allowing myself to pretend that is a man, but I know it's just paint. You can't stop yourself also having that sensation. And I think that's what I meant about the pleasure of self-deception as an essential part of what it is to be looking.
Yeah. If I was. This pleasure is in making things and discovering what you want to make or what it is you want to think is so big. I was constantly thinking of what about AI? What about AI? Because then this whole range of not knowing, that's the opposite of the prompt, telling the machine what you want to see. Does that ever worry you, or do you think about it at all?
No, I mean, I think about AI. My main sense of AI is I think there are going to be so many smart criminals that can use AI to hoodwink us and to scam us out of existence. I don't have the anxiety, oh, it's going to stop everybody drawing, or it's going to stop people writing.
Or music or writing or...
Or writing. I think some, a lot of stuff we may yet find that there's some either talented people who give very good prompts, but it's hard to imagine until one can make an artificial consciousness, which may be a separate project, to imagine a real emotion being behind something that AI is making. And one can give a simulacrum of emotion, but one either has to say, in fact, we humans are really fooling ourselves that we have a real emotions, that's our starting point of consciousness. I mean, we've tried it in the studio. Everybody's tried ChatGPT or video versions of them. But for us, and it may be different in a lot of other studios, they've not yielded any interesting results. And we realized it's going to take months of giving prompts to try to fix something that looks like a charcoal line you could make in half a second. So I think there are certain things that it does extremely well and efficiently, but I don't lie awake thinking, oh, I'm going to be superseded by AI.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for this, this encouragement. We're talking a lot about drawing, but there are so many other things in the studio and part of your work. And sound is one, language is one. Language as something you can understand or something that is made to confuse you, or maybe we can have that clip where you're listening to the pages. Which was it? That's Shards.
Number 9. This was. Just trying to think how does one deal with an archive? What are all the histories taken in different sheets of paper? So it's a fragment that comes from that. That's its context.
And what of these leaves? What of these pages? What were they asking or telling us?
Your turn is not next. Half your house is still built from your words. Beware of the age of 33. There will be one happy man in northeastern Brazil. Let us be sensible. Winter will end at 11 a.m. You will have a kingdom between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m.
Was it? So suddenly the lecture turns into a performance, and here as well. What were you, when you think of such an act, and I suppose that's also born while doing it, suddenly you think, well, I can tell what's on the page, but I can also listen to it. But there's like meanings build up.
Yes, I think that came from an improvisation we were doing for a theatre production, which had to do with the First World War and objects from the First World War. And we had musicians, and we ascribed one musician to each object around us, like a chair or a glass. And the different actors would pick up this object, each of which had a kind of an importance in the broader story. And if it was a cello, then the cello would play as he listened to the glass, or a trumpet when someone else put their head on a chair to listen to it. And it was about suddenly understanding that objects could be filled with these different sounds, and this is a kind of a one-man's band version of trying to show that. Of trying, I suppose, to say it's also about the mass and the overmass, the excess with which we are bombarded all the time, from which we have to try to pick things away to make sense.
Yeah, I thought it's a very physical representation of a feed of an Instagram or a
it's a kind of
timeline, which is constantly.
So I think it is. It's things that are kind of, in Instagram you're flipping through, so you see one at a time. But to try to have all of those coming together, it was again taking something that you can make visible in the studio that in other ways is more invisible. In the same way, to make a drawing of a 1920s telephone exchange. In those exchanges, you'd physically take a wire from one person calling and plug it into the call that it has to go to. And so a telephone switchboard is this three-dimensional object full of these graphic lines, which are in fact electric wires connecting different parts of the keyboard. So it's an old mechanical system, 100 years out of date, but it's still a very strong visual representation of a very present condition today, much more than in the 1920s when you'd have 1 or 2 phone calls a day, but not have 20 emails or 100 emails and so many WhatsApps, so many Instagrams, all these different things coming into you, that one realizes one is bombarded by so many different things. So that's another easy example in which one can make very visible in the studio, or the processes of the studio naturally can make things visible that otherwise are present but not as directly visible.
When you, with all the references you use, the influence of other people is very important, but your youth is also very important. I think that in almost every project you mention an image from your youth, a child's book, the first trip to Rome, the Baedeker travel guides, the landscapes. Is that time still so present in you, or in everybody maybe?
I think
that it's
present.
so rich?
I think it's, as we know from not just psychoanalysis, but so many kinds of investigations of the mind, so much is laid down so fundamentally at different stages of childhood that yes, that is how we are constructed. But I'm really interested in the clarity of emotion that one feels as a child before you are jaded. The first time you see a shocking piece of archival footage or a shocking photograph, the visceral effect that has, and that when one looks at that same image now, one's task is to try to find in oneself that same shock and horror that is there, to do justice to that image. I mean, you think of the burning sense of injustice of children. It's not fair. That child had this and I didn't get it, but that sense of what's not fair, to hang on to different moments of strongly, purely felt emotion. And I think for me, often there are references back in childhood when there was a clarity which is much less so as an adult. So I think, childhood does. My wife complains that me and my brother and sisters and I spend our lives talking about the foods we used to eat as a child, and thinks there's something wrong with us that we're so obsessed with particular brands of chocolate and biscuits that don't exist anymore.
And how come? Is that because they all disappeared, or is it because, well, thinking of your childhood was quite specific, being in South Africa? I mean, there were different realities that you had to deal with, and maybe you got to know slowly these realities.
Yes, I don't think that had related to the particular baker's biscuits or the different biscuits, but certainly I think everybody often naturalizes the conditions in which they're growing up. You assume this is how the world is, and you have to unlearn that to see how things are. In South Africa, growing up as a white boy at an all-white, all-boys school, which seemed kind of not unnatural at the start, for me it was fairly early on to understand how unnatural that was. And that was largely because my parents were very involved with legal cases in which the iniquities of apartheid became very, very clear. So there
Because they were attorneys,
they were
both?
They were lawyers. They were both lawyers.
Lawyers, yeah.
And so that was very much part of dinner conversation about the terrible things that were happening. Whereas for most of the boys I was at school with, whose parents were not in that position, they just accepted the apartheid condition as being natural. And so for them it was kind of a shock, I think, when they were 18 or 20, or whenever they came to actually understand, and some of them I'm sure never did, the iniquities of apartheid. That was a much earlier revelation or clarity for me. And for other, some other boys also in the school, I'm sure.
And now South Africa, well, of course you work there, you work in Johannesburg, you worked there all your life. Although you travel a lot, everything starts there, all the work starts there. And it's always present in every work, although you've also dealt with the whole Western history, Western culture, the Greek, the Roman, the big composers, the big painters, all like the whole classical Western canon, let's say, which is a bit rusty in the meantime now. You were one of the first to acknowledge that there are so many other influences, so many things that we forget. How is that hoe moet ik dat zeggen? Een plicht. What is a plicht? A duty, yes. Is there a duty for you to constantly refer and put these worlds together?
I mean, you're right that a lot of the work I've done has been based on or references different parts of the Western canon. And there's a trajectory or a history to that, and very little. I mean, there's some, but not a lot to traditions of African art making and sculpture particularly. To give an explanation of it, not a justification, but an explanation. During the apartheid years, it was predicated an idea of identity politics. This was where white people lived, this was the music white people would listen to, this was their way of life, and black people lived in a different place, and they would listen to different music, and they should really be living in huts in rural areas. So if you were against this absolute separation of apartheid, it meant there was a kind of a resistance to this identity politics, which took the form of saying, no, Beethoven and the other operas should be open for anyone to listen to. It shouldn't be only white people that can go to a symphony concert. There was a great belief that Africans should be making tribal art. So they're saying, no, Africans should be able to take the whole, the whole of modernism, the whole of any art-making tradition and work with that. So there was a blinding to what was actually there from Africa, and in trying to make the Western tradition more universal. So it's taken a long time to unlearn that also, to understand the limits of that kind of understanding. But to get back to your question about Johannesburg, the work is always, I would say, either inflected or infected by being there. And that's mostly in the most literal sense of working with performers, musicians, actors, dancers from Johannesburg even when a piece is going to end up as an opera in a European opera house, the making of it, the construction of each scene happens in workshops in my studio with performers that I would work with to work out the structure of scenes or how things could work. And so that definitely is there in a lot of the work. And even the projects which, on the one hand, are based on some classical European work, are very much, for me, about ideas that are present in South Africa at the moment. So a production, we have a revival of a production of Faustus, which is based on Goethe, on Goethe's Faust. I think you couldn't get more classical European than that. In fact, the piece is about the pact with the devil that was made in the negotiations in South Africa at the end of apartheid. And the very fact of it being such a canonical piece meant it was possible to take liberties with it, to chop it and change it, to have it as something against which you could see a different interpretation. And then there are a lot of works which are made from the ground up in the studio, like The Head and the Load, which is a piece about African porters in the First World War, or Great Yes, Great No, which is about a journey from Marseille to Martinique in the Second World War, which is really about what is the presence of negritude or different kinds of thinking from Fanon, which are still so present in South Africa, even though it's set in Martinique.
Yeah, and in a way, it's also filling in the blank spots or the blind spots that we have. I mean, this whole story about African porters in the First World War, which is central in one of your pieces.
Yes.
And that's a story that's not known. I mean, World War One is trenches in Flanders to us.
So I mean, I suppose there are different kinds of ignorance. The one was, so the basic fact was that in Africa, there were 1 million casualties in the First World War, mostly civilians. Mostly from malnutrition and the results of the edges of war rather than being directly shot. But there were 2 million porters, African porters, that took part in the war, carrying material across for battles in Central Africa and Southwest Africa. But the project started with a kind of ignorance, an ignorance on my own part, and different kinds of ignorance. The firstly was that, in fact, that history has been suppressed, to being deliberately expunged. So there are no memorials to Africans who died in the First World War, though there are 1 million memorials in French villages, even in South African villages, of white people who died in the war. So that's a kind of a hidden history. In the victory celebrations in 1919, there was a decision made by the British Army not to invite African soldiers to be part of the parade. So there's some deliberate things. But more than that, I was intrigued by the blindnesses that I had. So, as you said, being so filled with stories of the trenches and the First World War and the English war poets, that filled all the space to think about the war. Even though I kind of knew, okay, Lawrence of Arabia was connected to the First World War in some way, and I know in Southwest Africa there'd been a battle. So there were pieces of knowledge I had which I'd kind of kept separate. So that was another kind of ignorance. And then even knowing those facts, still not putting them together. So the making of the piece is not me giving a lecture to people who don't know the history that I know. It's about all of us in the project trying to discover what that history was.
So in fact, is that void, is there a sort of irritation then with yourself that you didn't know before, that you had to know, or is there a shame involved?
There's certainly an irritation at not being aware of it that I should have known it. But I think that anger at oneself is a good goad for work to begin. Yes, if you know all the answers, it's much less interesting to do.
Well, then you stop working. Well, God forbid. Yeah. I think it would be nice to look at another clip. Which one? Because there's so many nice. Do you want one more?
Maybe I'll talk. Maybe we can end, because I can see we have a clock here telling us that's counting out our doom over here.
Yeah.
Maybe we can end with showing a bit of one of the productions of Sybil.
Yeah.
But just to talk about it for a moment before.
Yes, before, because we'll end with the bang, with the show.
Okay.
Yeah, well, let's,
Okay.
yeah.
So
The Sybil,
it's a chamber opera, and there's
when,
just the
when
last
was
4
this?
minutes.
About
This was
10 years ago?
It was 2019
Okay.
that it was made, about 6 months before COVID began, when it had a very different kind of presence once COVID had set in. But just to give you the briefest background, the story of this Sybil, the Cumean Sybil, who lives in a cave outside Naples, was that she was a prophetess. She'd be able to tell your future, and you would go to the Sybil with your questions, which you would write down and leave for her. And there were questions, how long will I live? Will I survive COVID? What's going to happen in the future? All of the questions we might ask. And you would leave them at the mouth of the cave. And the Sybil would write the answer to your questions on an oak leaf and put the oak leaf back at the mouth of the cave. And then you would go to collect your answer. But as you got to the mouth of the cave, there would always be a wind, so that the leaves would swirl around. So you never knew if the fate you were picking up was your fate or someone else's fate. And that was kind of I suppose, one of the central thoughts of the production. And this is the last 4 minutes of the chamber opera.
And you said it changed because of COVID.
I think the way one reads the texts suddenly had a whole new reading once COVID was there of these.
Yeah.
Suddenly there was, suddenly uncertainty became the order of the day for everyone. No one knew, was everybody going to die? Were half the people going to die? Was no one going to die? Should we take this medicine or that medicine? Would vaccines work? Would they not? There was a kind of generalized uncertainty, which for me seems the right way of apprehending the world, of understanding how provisional so many things are, but which swept us all for that period. And if you look back on it, you think, my God, were we insane? Washing our vegetables with detergent before we could eat them, putting our heads in plastic bags before we would go into a supermarket. There was a kind of a panic of uncertainty, of desperate uncertainty.
It's like a ready-made opera, in fact. You could have invented it, I think.
It was a very strange time.
It was, in a way, a good period for you. You told me
for
just
me
before
it was,
we
For me,
came
it was, I was with my family in the house in a beautiful garden with my studio there, unable to travel for a year. It was a blessing. It was an extraordinary... We all got COVID, but we all luckily survived, although I know many people didn't, and many people are still sick. But for those months of being able to work quietly was... and to have the children back living at home again for those first 12 weeks, or however long we were locked down, was kind of wonderful. But maybe we end just with the last 4 minutes.
Can play
And we'll go 2 minutes over time.
Yeah, and that's the only bigger picture we have of a production, because we have all these drawings, but what it leads up to, you'll have a very short impression of it. So please, number 10.
Say
Thank you very much. Thank you.